Yeah, we can say good afternoon. Good afternoon and welcome to Remote Work Wednesday on behalf of the uh, Remote Online Initiative and the K-State Extension Community Vitality Team. We're really glad to have you join us. We have other folks joining us. I'm Ron Wilson, Director of the Huck Boyd Institute for Rural Development with K-State Extension Community Vitality. Many thanks to Deborah Cole as a Community Vitality Specialist and Program Leader Coordinator for the K-State Extension Community Vitality Team. This call is a project of the Remote Online Initiative, and there you see the website, kansasremotework.com. And through that program, we're offering month-long online classes that enable participants to become trained and certified as remote workers or remote work team leaders. The outgrowth of that has become Remote Work Wednesday, a free Zoom call on the second Wednesday of each month for anyone interested in remote work. So our next call will be on February 11th. So you can save that date, mark it on your calendar, even with a QR code. The goal of these calls is simply to learn about the opportunities and challenges of remote or hybrid work for those who choose it and have that option. Really appreciate today's speaker, Dr. Christopher Petty. Many of us remember Chris from his days as an extension professional here in Kansas in a couple of different locations. He's advanced on to a federal agency position in which he's functioned both in the office and as a remote worker and back. So he's seen both sides of that situation. Chris, we really appreciate you joining us. Please tell us about your experience and what we might learn from it.
All right. Well, thank you very much for the introduction, Ron. I'm going to be real informal. I just have a handful of slides I'm going to present. And as you mentioned, I've done a little bit of both. And I'm going to talk about kind of the how and why that happened. And I'm going to give you some of my personal experience of both the pros and cons of that work. Next slide, please. All right. First, I have to give you the disclaimer. This is my thoughts, opinions, and ideas about remote work and not that of my employer. So next slide, please. As Ron said, I work for the U.S. Department of Agriculture. NIFA, which stands for the National Institute of Food and Agriculture, is located in downtown Kansas City, and I've worked here since 2020. But prior to that, I worked for about 6 years in Southwind District of K-State Extension, which is located in southeast Kansas. I was housed out of Fort Scott. And then before that, I worked in Graham County Extension, which is now part of the Twin Creeks Extension District, and that was in northwest Kansas out of Hill City. So I was blessed with the opportunity to work for K-State Extension on both sides of the state, and I had a great career there. Next slide. My educational background starts in rural Missouri, where I'm from. I went to the University of Central Missouri, which is a non-land grant agricultural school. I got an undergraduate degree in ag business. And then later on in life, I went to Kansas State University, where I got another undergraduate degree in animal science. And I got my extension career started after that. Went out to Western Kansas after getting that animal science degree. While I was in employment with Kansas State, I got my master's degree in adult learning and leadership. Then I left Kansas State University Extension for USDA NIFA, and while employed here at NIFA, I received my PhD in organizational leadership and actually did my dissertation on 4-H agent retention in Kansas. So anybody wants to talk about that, I have all kinds of numbers and facts and figures of that regard. Next slide. Okay. As far as remote work, we can actually go back farther in time from this slide right here because I got my start in remote work like a lot of folks in Kansas Extension did, and that was during the COVID pandemic. And we thought 1 week we'd be back in office, and we muddled through. I answered emails, I did YouTube videos, and 1 week turned into 2 weeks, and 2 weeks turned into 3 weeks. And as I told Ron earlier, it was like flying the plane as we built it. We were learning how to be remote workers kind of unexpectedly. And in the middle of the COVID-19 pandemic, I got hired on with the USDA. I was hired to work in person at a facility that's located by the Kansas City Zoo, which would require me to move to Kansas City. So I did. And again, I was working remotely because we thought in another month we'd be back in the office. And a month became 2 months, 2 months became 3 months, 3 months became 4 months. And eventually, USDA leadership said, hey, you're going to be fully remote. You've been fully remote for months now. You're doing the job. We're going to let you continue to do the job. So that's what I did. I did that for about 4 years as a remote worker. I moved back to rural Missouri, where I'm from. And then this spring, under the new presidential administration, we all received emails that, hey, we want you in person. We have a new office building in downtown Kansas City, and you're going to report there. So many of us work in the Kansas City area. Many of us work in the Washington, D.C. area. And there's a handful of us that were spread out because we were remote workers. And those individuals are in USDA facilities, Farm Service Agency offices, natural resource conservation offices spread out all across the country. So next slide, please. That was my start. Um, as I mentioned previously, we thought we were supposed to be in-person workers. One of the advantages of the fully remote situation was we were not fully hired up. USDA NIFA moved in 2019 from Washington, D.C. to Kansas City. And there was a little bit of, I don't want to use the word trouble, but we were trying to hire up to about 350 people. But part of that process was, hey, you have to move to Kansas City for this job. Now, when all the positions went fully remote, that allowed USDA NIFA to hire people from all over the country and fully staff. So that's what we did. As I mentioned, January 2025, that's when the process began to return USDA employees back to their in-person offices. Next slide. Okay. My father asked me when I returned in Kansas City, is it better or is it worse, that in-person work? And I said, Dad, it's not better or worse, it's different. There are pros and cons to each. Um, some of the things that I really like about in-person work is we can collaborate with our coworkers. I could not collaborate. I had to email my coworkers and wait for an email before. And now I can walk down the hallway and ask for information and say, hey, I need help with this. And so the in-person process has sped a lot of things up that we did by email before. There's value in knowing your colleagues. For 4 years, all of my colleagues were little square heads. I had met most of them in person. I didn't know them as individuals. I only knew them as square heads on the screen. There's a sense of belonging being in an office with your coworkers. And I'm going to talk a little bit more about that in the next slide. You know, there's that water cooler talk. How are you? How are your kids? What are you doing this weekend? We didn't really have as much of that. It was Zoom meeting, Zoom meeting, Zoom meeting. So now there's that camaraderie, there's that friendship, there's that knowing the people you work with. One of the pros that I like is I have a dedicated start and stop time in a work day. I come in at 8 o'clock. I leave at 4:30. There can be an expectation in remote work that you're always accessible because your computer's right there. And when I first started remote work and I didn't understand what the parameters of the remote work situation were, it was really, really easy to work really late at night. I had a supervisor that sent out emails at 11 p.m. and there's this expectation that the boss is working. So am I working as well? In person, that expectation is not there. You have dedicated hours. So for me, I like that part of the job. Next slide, please. All right, before I go into the cons, I want to mention that research indicates that there are some generational differences that are going to affect your opinions on remote work. For example, the baby boomers and the Generation X, depending on which generation you consider yourself to be a part of, the research indicates that you think differently about aspects of work than the millennial and Gen Z counterparts. And for example, I'm going to give you two examples actually. The older generations, the baby boomers and myself, who's a Gen Xer, we like those personal relationships. Um, we tend to think of our coworkers as friends. We tend to want to know what they're doing and how they're doing. And generally speaking, the millennials and the Gen Z workers separate their work life from their non-work life. They go to work and their coworkers are their coworkers, and they go home and their friends are their friends, and they're not combined. So, uh, with that in mind, the reason why I tell you that is your thoughts on whether you like or don't like remote work may be influenced by what generation you're in, and if you like that camaraderie or uh, that in person work with your friends and your friends that are your coworkers. The other example I'm going to give you of the difference between millennials and Gen Z workers, and this doesn't relate to remote work, but it's just an example of the differences between generations, has to do with salaries. For millennials and Gen Z workers, they are typically influenced by salaries and they see the salary aspect of their position as a positive. And the reason for that is, uh, especially the Gen Zs and now the generation after them are newer into the workforce. So they're working up their career ladder. Generally, they start at the bottom of the salary field and they're working forward. So for them, salaries is the motivator. Gen X individuals and Boomer individuals, they tend to be at the peak of their careers. They're at the peak of their salaries, and they know that salary increases, if they're going to retire soon, are not going to be a thing. Therefore, they're less motivated. So research out there indicates that different generations and whether you're an introvert or an extrovert is going to affect how you feel about work and can also affect how you feel about remote or in-person work. Okay, now that I've chased that rabbit down the hole, let's go to the next slide. Okay. These are what for me are some of the cons of the job. That's a painting that's in an art gallery in Lenexa. But that's what my drive looks like to my office. It's 64 miles one way every day. And so if there's an accident, it takes me 2 hours to get to or from work each day. There's also a lot of cost involved in that commute. There's a lot of wear and tear in your vehicles, a lot of fuel. Um, when I went back to in-person work, it's almost like you get a salary decrease because you have to spend money commuting and repairing your vehicle and buying lunch in the city and whatnot. Um, Boredom, when I you look at that bullet point right there, I'm thinking, well, what does that mean? Well, what it means is if I have 6 hours of work to do, I have to be here from 8 a.m. to 4:30 p.m. So then I have 2 hours that I have to find things to do in an office. Where was you're a remote worker, you can fill your time. I could put the laundry in the dryer, I could check the mail, I could go down to the deli, I could talk to the neighbor if I needed to, I could do my 6 hours of work and be done. Here, I'm in the office. So it's really easy on slow days, slow times of year, around the holidays, that week between Christmas and New Year's, there's just not a lot to do. So in my opinion, that's a con of being in the office. I would prefer to be remote just for that aspect sometimes. As I mentioned, multitasking, throwing the laundry in if I need to, checking the mail. I like that. I liked being able to, feed the cats. I like to be able to fill my coffee cup up and check the mail and do the laundry. I still have to do all those things, but now I have to do them outside of work. So before work, after work, and on the weekends, I have to get all that stuff done because in person, I'm here to work. So, you know, your task when you're in the office is kind of one-sided. It's work. Um, so for me, that's a negative. I enjoy that ability to do other things that remote work sometimes allows, especially if you're in between meetings or you're in a slow time of year. Next slide. These are some suggestions from my own personal experience. When I started as a remote worker in Kansas City, I was in a studio apartment and I couldn't turn off the work because my office was my home. There was no separation between the two. Um, I had that, as I mentioned, I had a supervisor that liked to work late. So my computer and my phone were dinging late at night. And it felt like I was always at work. When I was remote working from rural Missouri, I was lucky enough to have a spare bedroom that I made into an office. And at the end of the day, turn the computer off and shut the door. And so I was able to separate my work from my home life. The next bullet point applies whether you're an in-person worker or a remote worker. Take your vacation days. As American workers, we tend to take a lot of pride in how much work we do and how much we can get done. Those vacation days are ours. They're good for us. Um, they're good for you if you're a remote worker to get away from that office that's in your house. They're good for you if you're an in-person worker as well. And my last suggestion, and I've talked about this some before, is stick to regular hours. It's easy to not do that if you're a remote worker. It's also easy to not do that if you're an extension in general. Sometimes you work days and nights and weekends, and it feels like you're never not working. If you can get away with it, if you can do it, what I would suggest is you carve out your basic regular hours. And I've seen email signatures from folks that say, I'm available Monday through Friday, 8 to 5 p.m. And that indicates that I'm not answering emails or phone calls outside of these hours. I think that's a great suggestion. If you're a remote worker and the lines are blurred between your work hours and your home hours, set some boundaries. All right. Next slide. All right. That's what I have for you. Like I said, it's all from personal experience. Some of y'all may have different experiences of your own of remote or in-person work and may think differently than I do. I think there's pros and cons to both. I'd love to hear what you think.
Chris, thank you so much. I think that was really outstanding and wise. There's a lot of wisdom in there. I have a question or two. I encourage anyone who wants to put your questions in the chat or feel free to unmute too. But so you talked about turning off the computer. That totally makes sense. But we've got these doggone gadgets, these smartphones that we have with us all the time. Uh, do you have a separate office cell, or how do you manage that? How do you handle that?
Well, Ron, that's a good question. I do have a separate office cell, but it has an on-off switch on it, and it's not on the weekends.
So you have a separate phone, and you can control that, manage it like
Correct.
your other daily schedule. I also wanted to ask, you got your PhD from, was it Columbia International
Correct.
or something like that?
Yep.
What was that? And I assume that was not an in-person educational
Right.
experience. Well, tell us about your experience getting a PhD online and what that was like.
Well, I would back up and talk first about my master's degree that I also got online while I was employed with K-State Extension. That was one of the benefits of being an extension employee was 3 credit hours per semester, which is fantastic. Um, a free education is something that you should never pass up. But it's work, you know. When I talk about not turning your computer off and your day never ending, when I was getting both that degree and my PhD, I turned my work computer off and my personal computer on.
Yeah.
So it's a lot of work and you have to adjust and you have to cut out and you're going to have to make some big lifestyle changes because, gosh, how do I say this in a nice way? You're going to have to give some things up in life. Um, so I tell people that my house wasn't as clean as it used to be, and my grass didn't get mowed as often as it was because I had a paper to write. So it's an adjustment, but it's nice to be able to do that remotely. It's got a lot of advantages. It's lower cost. You can work on your own time. Um, a lot of those online programs, even the online programs have an in-person session. You're supposed to go in for 2 weeks. So you have to factor in the travel and the time off from work and whatnot. So um, again, just like remote work, online school has a lot of pluses and minuses. You need to decide what's right for you. I would encourage you to take advantage of it if you're working for extension, those free credit hours.
It's great, Chris. Um, Question from the chat: how do you encourage collaboration with a team that is remote? When you're working with a team, how do you achieve a higher level of collaboration?
Golly, I wish there was a good answer for that. One of the things I'd say is um, from personal experience, at some point you probably need to be in person, even if it's only for a few days. Um, we host a big youth conference. It's the National 4-H Conference. It's in Washington, D.C. every year. And all of the employees were remote. We had never met each other. Then we fly to D.C. and we have to work together to run this conference. And if you know about group facilitation, you have to storm, form, norm. We didn't have time to do that. It was hit the ground running, get to work. And so there were a lot of challenges there. Some of those challenges I think can present to you in remote work where you're just a box and you're this big and you don't know your coworkers and you don't have a chance to collaborate. So my best advice is at some point during the year, even if it's only for a couple of days, you need to get together in person. That's a great question. I
Yeah,
wish
it
I had
is
a
a great.
better answer from a remote standpoint.
Well, we all wrestle with that. I really appreciate that insight, and that seems to be a, maybe I could say, a common thread that once you establish a little social capital with your teammates, that can go quite a ways. I mean,
Right.
that that can provide some foundational relationships that can help you weather through the storming and forming and norming.
To get you out of the silo, which is your laptop.
Yeah, yeah. Other questions? Any questions from the group?
Chris, you mentioned that you had to pivot very quickly, as most of us did. Are there any things that, as your team went on, you were really, really glad you put in place when you did go online, or, in hindsight, things that what would be your top things to make sure folks take care of as they're pivoting to online work?
Gosh, Ron and I were talking before the meeting started about this online work certificate, and I told him I wish we had something like that. We didn't have that, so we just kind of figured it out as we went. Just some little, here's how you do it. Here's the norms. Here's the tips and tricks. That'd be super helpful. And anybody that's going to go into a remote position or it's transferring, like it's going from in person to remote, ought to take something like that.
Another thing we touched on before this program started. Your boss is out of state in
Yep.
Mississippi.
Right.
So how does that work? How does your reporting work, or how does your project tracking work? Is there a check-in once a month, once a week,
Right.
or how does that operate in practice?
I think it was Warren Buffett who said of employees that you hire good people and get out of their way and you have them do good work. And remote work requires trust that good people are going to do good work because there's always, it's pretty easy not to do good work or any work in a remote situation. But I check in once a month with my boss who's in Mississippi, south of Memphis, Tennessee. And then at least once a year, we all get together in person, usually in Washington, D.C. So um, I feel like that's probably a little harder. If you like to have control over your employees, if you like to micromanage, it's going to be harder to do in a remote work situation.
So, do you have an annual performance review, like a
Right.
typical operation? Yeah.
I do, and it's based on the work that you do. I think there's a little bit of subjectivity to it, with the boss being hundreds of miles away. It's good to have good relationship with your employer that situation.
Very good. Any other questions? I know we have a lot of other commitments today, and I think we'll wrap up this session unless there's any other comments or questions from the group. Our next session will be February 1. We have a couple of really interesting programs pending. Not prepared to announce those just yet. So stay tuned and we'll try to keep you posted about that. Chris, thanks for a really terrific presentation. I know you have a busy schedule. Going to give you at least a virtual round of applause here, and appreciate your insights, your past good work with the K-State Extension, and the leadership you're giving. And another day we'll talk about 4-H agent retention, maybe.
All right. Well, thank you, Ron. It's been a pleasure. I appreciate you asking me to speak today.
Thank you very much, Chris. Folks, we'll let Chris go. Be watching for information about our next Remote Work Wednesday on February 11. And with that, thanks for joining us and have a wonderful Remote Work Wednesday. Good afternoon.